Cool. All right. So thanks, Donna. Always a pleasure to go after Donna. Um, we uh, Traditionally we divided this talk up into Donna would do behavior and I would do change in behavior. But what occurred to me is that we need more of a link to what's coming later in the week. Um, and it's not by accident that behavior changes. The way you change behavior is by intervening to change it. And so the whole science of how you develop an intervention and how you think about that intervention in relation to how you're trying to change behavior is something we realized we needed to bridge to. So my talk is bridging between what Donna has just introduced in terms of theories of behavior and what you'll hear from Billy Namshani later in the week in terms of research designs. So with that as context, here's what I'd like to touch on.
My time is up.
Okay. Um, so I'd like to set a little bit of the context for mobile health. So some of the motivation, why do we bother with this? I want to talk a little bit about the pace of work in mobile health, because that's a really important piece of context. And I want to address the digital divide, because this is something that people often worry about. At the end of the day, the thing that we're really going to care about is whether our mHealth interventions work, and I'd like to take a look at the evidence, the state of the evidence for that. And then I'd like to talk about how it is that we learned how to get mHealth tools to harness behavior change better. And one of the points that I'll make is we've tended to think about developing interventions in a very cross-sectional way. We develop an intervention package that we then push out and we think we're done. And so we have left the whole process of what do we do if it doesn't work and how do we adapt to what's going on with the person over time. We've really left that hanging. And that's where our science is moving and where I think a lot of the really exciting work is going. So that's what I'm going to do. So just, you all know this, but to quickly recap why we use mobile health technology for behavior change, the first reason why people like me got into it was because we're trained as clinical psychologists, many of us, so we know how to change behavior. And we know how to do it in one way. Give me the 50-minute therapy hour. You got to come and sit with me for 50 minutes and I'll I'll do magic and change your behavior. But there are certain things that are a real problem. One is, what if you live in a place where there are not people that you can go to visit that way? Another is, if you do live in a place where there are people like me, you have to drive and pay for expensive parking. And the other thing is that when you need help, I'm not going to be there. So these are real disadvantages with the way that we had been developing interventions to reach people, and we needed to address that. And mobile health offered us a way of trying to deal with reach, trying to improve reach. Another, and this will come throughout all of the things I talk about, is human interventionists like me are expensive. And a lot of what we want to work with when Vivek talks to you about these health risk behaviors, they're highly prevalent. Um, every behavior change expert in the country could be treating people 24/7, and we would probably not make a dent in these behaviors. So we've got to have a way to scale and reach more of the public while lowering the cost. So this was another major driver for why we became interested in mobile health. And then I think the thing we didn't even realize at the time, but it's become an even more exciting reason why we stay here and are really sort of newly invigorated, has to do with the continuous dense data that we now get from smartphones and wearables, which give us all kinds of ability to know about people's context and what's going on with them in real time, so that we now can find ways to help them, not just when they're sitting in the office in the 50-minute hour, but when they're out in their real lives. So these are the big motivations for why mobile health, I think, is really exciting. I also uh, want to remind us how quickly things are changing. What you see here, this big blue thing, this was the very exciting technology that first came out when I was a new faculty member. When we no longer have to crunch our data analytics by hand, we had access to this magic thing that weighed 2 tons, cost $1 million, and had a whole 20 gigabytes of memory processing speed. So now, and that was really very exciting. So now, fast forward to 2010, and suddenly you can get for $150, 32 gigabytes. Now, go to your Apple Store, go to Best Buy, and you can get 256 gigabytes for $150. So this is moving very, very fast. The capabilities are really growing. And how is this happening? You guys are mostly probably too young to remember the TV show Get Smart that came out when I was in high school. But it really puts this in context for me. Get Smart was a comedy about a spy who had a shoe phone. He could take off his shoe and talk on this phone. And this was science fiction at the time. Nobody had heard of a shoe phone, and we all wanted one. We thought, how cool would that be if you could have your phone with you all the time? But never in a million years did I think this would happen in my lifetime. Well, now um, we certainly, first we had phones that looked like the shoe phone. They were about the size of the shoe phone. And now they have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And how is that happening? That is happening by virtue of this principle called Moore's Law. Moore was the co-founder of Intel, and he observed this phenomenon. It's pretty amazing that every 2 years, the number of transistors that you can fit on an integrated circuit doubles, which means that you get a doubling of processing speed, memory capacity, and the number of sensors you can put in a device. And that's why when Donna holds up her phone, it's small and it does magic. We've got better than shoe phones. Who would have thought? Who would have predicted? So before we go steamrolling down this pathway, I want to address the thing that many people worry about. That we know, yeah, we've got high tech, but we know we've also got a problem of the 1%, the 2%. We've got a whole lot of people that are left behind and really need help with their health. What's going to happen? Do we want to leave? Are we going to leave them behind? As Obama pointed out, today high-speed broadband, the internet is not any longer a luxury; it's really a necessity. And there is evidence of a digital divide if you think about it in terms of um, broadband access from computers. What you see here is a diagram of the number of computers per 100 people in different parts of the globe. And what you can see is the dark brown areas in the US, Australia, Western Europe. There's about one computer for every 1 or 2 people. By the time you get to Africa and certain parts of Asia, you have more like either none or 5 computers for every 100 people. So there's a lot less computers if that's the way that you access the internet. And this is the way that we used to measure the digital divide. We would look at how many households had high-speed cable. However, now we have another way to get to the internet, and this is that way. So if you look here on the left part of the slide, these are data from Pew showing the prevalence of smartphone use, the dark gold, other cell phone, not smartphone, the lighter gold, and the sort of the lightest, no cell phone use. And what you see is, smartphones are much more prevalent in the US and Western Europe than in Africa. But even in Africa, if you combine smartphone and cell phone use, 80% of the population has a mobile phone. This is Africa, where 25% of the households have electricity, 35% of the roads are paved, but 80% of the population has some kind of a mobile phone. So this has been a game changer. They may not have had the infrastructure that we had to get ourselves high-speed broadband cable, but they have another way to access the internet. And it's been the same story in the U.S., where here what you see is the dark blue is the proportion of smartphone, lighter blue, non-smartphone cell phone, gray, no cell phone access. And you can see that right from the outset, there has been more mobile phone access in Hispanic and African American subgroups of the population than in Caucasians. Probably because this was the way that you can access the internet and that you can communicate with people through a mobile technology. You don't have broadband. So we have this phenomenon now called smartphone dependence, where 61% of Blacks, 59% of Hispanics have that as the only way that they can access the internet. But the important point is this has been a workaround. As opposed to being a digital divide barrier, this has been a leg up by which underserved populations could gain access to internet. Okay, and what it has meant is that it's possible now to reach and transmit health interventions to large portions of populations where you couldn't otherwise reach them. So these are data from a study that Angela did with 1 million people in India. And this is parts of India where there's no rural health providers, very hard to reach people, but it was possible to reach them with a text messaging intervention to send out diabetes prevention messaging. So it's a game changer in a good way, not in a sort of an impediment way. So now let's shift gears and take a look at how are we doing? What's the evidence that that the interventions we can do this way are working? Text messaging was the first type of intervention in this space, and it's been by far the most widely studied. This is a nice review. Just came out in the annual review of public health, and they come to the conclusion that there's pretty decent efficacy for text messaging interventions for physical activity and smoking cessation. There are some limitations, though. The designs, by and large, are not randomized controlled trials. So they're not the strongest designs, but there are some RCTs. And there are some other things that are interesting. So we've got pretty strong evidence that if you tailor messages as opposed to just use one size fits all, you personalize them, and you vary their frequency, that works better. Notice something else about this, and this will be important when you start to think about ecological momentary assessment prompts, and you start to think about JEDIs and ecological momentary interventions. By and large, what has been studied and what has an evidence base is messaging that is happening weekly, at most daily. When we're doing the kinds of interventions we're talking about now, we're talking about multiple times a day. There's not much of an evidence base for that. So this is something to keep in the back of your head. But when we're doing text messaging interventions, by and large, the mechanism we're using is that the text comes or the push notification comes as a prompt, as a reminder. It's an alert. Okay. Now let's move to interventions that are a little bit more complex. So these are reviews that include both text messaging, app-based interventions, wearables, and hybrids that involve a mix of a mobile health technology and some kind of a coach. So there was a first review of this work done by Bob Kaplan and Arthur Stone, 2013, they only found 21 randomized controlled trials of mobile health interventions. And of that number, only 29% of them showed that the mobile health intervention surpassed the control. That's not so terrific when you consider publication bias, which means that there are probably a whole lot of negative results that are sitting in people's file drawers. So it wasn't so great. The data for weight loss were fairly decent, 50% showing a benefit for the intervention compared to the control, but a little bit soft on the outcomes. They needed to have a benefit at one time point, not necessarily all, not necessarily the primary late outcome. Fast forward a few years, and now we have a review that was done by the American Heart Association, published in 2015. By now, there's 38 mobile health randomized control trials, and now a little bit more of the obesity ones are showing effectiveness at 63%, but it's still not fabulous, and it's still only at one time point. So we have a signal. We've got promising work. Do we have something that insurance is ready to pay for? Probably not yet. So let's now touch on, when we're talking about these kinds of interventions that use apps and text messaging and so forth, what is the sort of the core theoretical model that we're thinking about? By and large, everything is a variant of a control systems approach. And Donna showed you a very complex control systems device with lots of reservoirs of fluids floating up and down. This is the simplest version. And the notion is that if you are going to self-regulate a health behavior, you need to know a few things. You need to know where you are now, what's your current status, where you're trying to get to, what's your goal. You need to be able to compare them, see if there's a discrepancy, and if there is, align your behavior, change the behavior to get them into alignment. And obviously, this is the kind of model that came from engineering. It's not a very sort of a warm, fuzzy model, but it still works pretty well. And it works particularly well if you're talking about nice physical objects, like you've got a flat tire, and that's your current state. And here's your goal. You want a tire that looks like that. So you just keep pumping air into the tire until it looks like the puffed up tire. Okay, so how about the kinds of comparative control system problems that we face in our daily life? Here's our goal, a 500-calorie lunch. Here's our current state. Does it match? Is it discrepant, or is it compatible with the goal? It's close, actually, and it will depend on whether you put mayo on the hamburger and so forth. But the fact that there's some diversity of opinion means it's tough. And this is much more like the kinds of challenges that we're likely to face as we're trying to self-regulate. So we have been building systems to solve this kind of problem in weight loss interventions for quite some time now. So, do I dare press this? Yes. Okay. So we started with Palm Pilots. We then moved to Androids. We moved to iPhones. We're still using iPhones. We use both Android and iPhone. We started with accelerometers that you couldn't get a reading from in real time. We moved to ones that Bluetooth the information onto your phone. We now have wearable ones that you can wear on your skin. We have depicted the goals through thermometers, through traffic light colored fans that show, this is the diabetes prevention program on an app, so that you can see a calorie allowance and a fat gram allowance, and there's also certain amounts of physical activity you have to get, and it's all being presented on these devices. We change as the Apple Watch introduced these sort of circles. We shifted to those. People want to see this kind of newer imagery. So we've made various shifts. And we have sometimes in-person coaching, sometimes coaching on the telephone because it eases some of the burden. So the question is, what do you think? We've changed now. This is a set of interventions probably over a 15-year period. Is this the same intervention or is it a set of different interventions as we've changed? Who says what? Who says the same? Who says it's different? The more people say it's different. Why is it different?
Interaction element, like the interaction.
Okay, the technology is for sure changing. Yes, um, the technology is changing, and there is an interaction with the technology. I would argue that this is more the same than different because what's the same is the behavior change techniques. Every single one of these interventions, regardless what the technology is, has used goal setting, self monitoring, decision support. You can look up the calories and the fat grams of what you're eating. You get some kind of feedback. Sometimes we use incentives, and there is some amount of social support and accountability. So I would suggest that that's really what's in common and functionally makes these very much the same. Um, so what I would say to reassure you about not being so scared about working in this mHealth space is that, yeah, the technology changes really fast. But human behavior change mechanisms remain the same or evolve very, very slowly. We're just not that fast at changing. And we basically we're drawing upon similar behavior change mechanisms no matter what technology we're using. So let me show you uh, some of the data that we've collected that convinced me of that. These are data from a study that we did with veterans, late 50s and 60s, when Palm Pilots were cutting edge technology. And none of them had ever seen a Palm Pilot before. They were all being treated for obesity in the VA's group MOVE program. So they're getting diet, physical activity, and behavior change. And all that's varying is whether they're recording on paper and pencil or they're recording on that Palm Pilot that I showed you, that mobile technology. And here's the data. Blue is the folks who were recording on technology. Red is the folks that were recording on paper and pencil. Solid line is if they went to 80% of their treatment sessions, their in-person treatment sessions. Dotted line, they went to less. If they had the Palm Pilot and they didn't go to most of their sessions, they were not really engaged in their treatment, the Palm Pilot is sitting in a drawer someplace, it's not fixing them. They're not losing any weight. They're actually gaining some weight. On the other hand, if they're hearing, they're engaged in the treatment, they're going and learning the skills they need to learn, then the technology gives them a very nice leg up. It's the solid blue line compared to the solid red line. These poor folks that are going to almost every treatment group and they're trying to record on paper and pencil, they're not losing any weight at all. So the technology really does something, but it's not doing it alone. It in and of itself is not doing the magic. So some of the principles I live by are, it's not the technology alone that's doing the work. It's how the technology is catalyzing these behavior change mechanisms. And so our task is to figure out most efficiently how to get mobile health technologies to very potently harness these behavior change mechanisms. The way we've done this up until this point has been largely by randomized controlled trials. I'm a big believer in randomized controlled trials for finding out what works, but I think we need new methods to learn how to answer this question of how to harness the behavior change principles. So let me give you an example. The example I'm going to use is the example of trying to harness social support and social connectedness in a mobile health intervention. So we know that there's a large, huge literature that social support helps people make changes. Um, the problem is, it is our core challenge in making things scalable. So probably our most effective, our real gold standard health behavior change intervention is the diabetes prevention program, which you see the outcomes here. It compared to a placebo or to the drug metformin and given to people with prediabetes, it produces greater weight loss and more sustained weight loss, and it delays the conversion from prediabetes to diabetes. Extremely successful. Um, not still not widely reimbursed because there's this other problem. This is the cost of doing uh, metformin compared to lifestyle intervention. The way it was done in the diabetes prevention program, it was done by individuals. It costs $1,800 to do this intervention. It's a lot of money. You can bring the cost down to under $1,000 by doing it in group treatment rather than one-on-one, but that's still a lot of money. And this is our big barrier, that the way you do the diabetes prevention program and most of our behavior change interventions, you have to have a lot of treatment sessions. It's between 16 and 32 sessions. So it's a big hurdle. People, experts, cost money. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we did some preliminary work thinking, well, how about if you don't have to use the experts, you can use peers, you can use friends, you can use what's already in the natural environment. You can use the social support that is inherent already. And so we looked at this in an online setting. This is a large online weight loss network, about 27,000 people in it. And we looked at the social networks that people establish in this online web network. Do they make friends with other people? And then we went on to look at that in relation to their weight loss. And what we found was that that only about 11% of these people actually friended somebody in the weight loss network. But if they did, um, most of them, remember, didn't have friends, and they still lost some weight. They lost on average 2.5%. If they made even a few friends between 1 and 5, so they're in this outer cluster, they lose an additional percentage point. They get up close to 3.5%. If they are connected to this, what's called the giant component, this is the 6 degrees of separation component, they got basically more friends, then they start to go up to what's close to a clinically meaningful weight loss benefit. They start to get close to 5%. If they are connected to a connector hub, this is somebody who is friends with people in lots of different groups, then look what happens. They go way up. And the number of connector hubs that they're connected to shows a dose response relationship to how much weight they lose. Whoa, this is potent. This is what we want to bottle. We could just think, if we could harness this natural social connectivity, what this could do. People could do it themselves with their communities. We wouldn't need to have all of this professional expertise. Think how we could bring down costs. So we decided to give it a shot. And we did it in the way that you typically do when you're doing a randomized controlled trial of a behavioral intervention. You give it your best shot. You figure out what should be in your intervention package. So we said, okay, 16 is the minimum number of treatment sessions that you needed to do the DPP. Could we cut it in half? Could we cut it to 8? Okay. And could we reconfigure the intervention so we are putting more support on the technology to bolster the effect of those 8 sessions that we're doing? Would that synergize? So we did a trial, which has just been published in obesity. It's called the ENGAGE trial. And we had three groups. One group was we call self-guided. They had DVDs showing the videotapes of the diabetes prevention program, and they're recording on paper and pencil. Then there's another group that is getting 8 in-person sessions, and they're also recording on paper and pencil. And then there is our technology group that is getting the in-person sessions, and they're recording on technology. So sort of similar to what we were doing with the Palm Pilot, where what mainly varied was whether people were using paper and pencil or technology. So if you think about the components in the package, what everybody got was some training in self-regulation skills. They all were supposed to be doing self-monitoring, and to capitalize, to harness this social support, we engaged people in a group weight loss competition. We didn't do this to have them compete. We did this because basically we've got 8 strangers who were trying to get to care about each other enough to support each other. So we financially incentivized them. So if their whole group lost the most weight, they all stood to benefit. So, and everybody, all 3 groups were enrolled in that. The 2 intervention groups also had the in-person support. They had the groups. They met with their 8 people in person, and they got some telephone coaching. And the technology group was really way over the top. They got this very cool app that addressed the question of if you want to support your peers in weight loss, what do you need to know about them? Well, we know that self-monitoring is probably the best predictor of weight loss. So maybe what you need to know is, are they self-monitoring? And this was partly because nobody wanted information about their weight loss floating around in cyberspace. So we needed to give them some information that was relevant, that wasn't that sort of personal. So this is showing if they're recording their meal intake. So it starts out red in the morning before they've entered anything. When they've entered a meal, it goes to yellow. When they've entered a couple of meals, it goes to green. Same with wearing the accelerometer. So what they can see is how their peers are doing in terms of adhering to things that are going to make them lose weight. Okay, so this should work great, right? Well, here's the data. So sure enough, the self-guided group did lose some weight. They lost about 3%. And here are the 2 other groups that got some in-person coaching. Now, who would you think is the group that lost the most weight? Probably think it's the one with the fancy technology. It's not. There's no difference actually between these 2 groups that got the 8 in-person sessions, but it's not going in the direction that we would like it to be going in. So this is one of these, I was amused by the number of you last night that talked about the mistakes you've made and what you've learned. I think this is really the only way that you learn. So this was a very expensive but useful learning experience. So what I think we learned most was a couple of things. One was that the first generation wireless accelerometer, like the first generation anything, not so great. You had to stick it with a paper clip to get it to restart. You couldn't tell when it was off. So that was one problem. Another problem was this was before everybody had smartphones, so we had to give them their smartphones, and then we had to take it away at the 6-month point, which I think accounts for why this is going back up like that. But the technology group never got the magnitude of weight loss that the group recording on paper and pencil did. And I think this is because we bungled the social network intervention. And let me tell you what happened. So we had all this, the financial incentives, they stand to gain if their group does well. They've got all this information about their group. They've got a chat room where they can communicate. And so what happened? Well, we as interventionists sat in the background watching this unfold. And we could see that there are certain people that are doing exactly what we want them to do. They're championing their peer group. They're saying, great, you got a green 3, you're adhering, you're self-monitoring. and there was silence. People would not respond. Now, we had two choices at this point. We could have jumped in and kept the conversation going, but then it completely changes the dynamic. It's didactic, it's the teacher. So we didn't. But what we saw happen was we actually saw what I feared was harm begin to unfold in this social context. People are putting themselves out there and they're not getting feedback. Why should I have predicted this? What proportion of people engaged in the online social networking? 11%. What's 11% of 8? So we have one person talking to herself. And so this is much harder to do than you might think. So it was sort of a great idea. It was our best shot, but it really didn't work. So what's wrong with this? This is where you wind up if you try to optimize your intervention with an RCT. So we're done with this RCT, and we have the treatment is actually better than the control in certain places, and it's worse than the non-tech control in certain ways. But we don't know which components are making the positive contribution. We don't know whether all the components are needed. We really don't know which component is not working because we've not disentangled them. So this is the last time I will ever try to optimize an intervention through an RCT first. This is what drove me and other people like me to the MOST framework, which is a framework that's been largely developed by Linda Collins and her colleagues, Billy Namshani, Susan Murphy, Danny Amaral, Peggy Klasna is now in this crew. And this is a suite of measures. MOST stands for multi-phase optimization strategy. And it is a suite of different intervention design techniques, which Billy will talk to you about in more depth later. I'm just going to give you some examples of them to give you sort of a high-level overview of why you use them. So it addresses the problem of the kitchen sink intervention that we tend to do in an RCT. We give it our best shot. We want it to work. We throw everything in that we know has a track record as an active component. But at the end of the day, we don't know which components are doing the most work. So one of these designs is a factorial design. I want to point out a confusion here. Many of you may think that MOST is a factorial experiment. It's not. It's this suite of intervention tools. The factorial experiment is just one. What you're basically doing in a MOST factorial experiment is you are turning components on and off to figure out which ones are doing the work and relative to some optimization criteria. Essentially, conceptually, you're trying to develop the best one-size-fits-all intervention. That's what you're doing. But we know that one size doesn't fit all. So the other tools in this suite are interventions that adapt to treatment non-response. So the SMART is the best. It is a strategy for adapting to when things don't work, and it takes you a little while to learn that things don't work. The JEDI is adapting to the fact that we need different things at different times throughout the day, like Donna's chocolate example. And we never had an ability to detect that before we had big data, but now we do. So I'm going to give you examples of 3 of these designs, just very high-level granular overview. So the first one, the factorial experiment, we have in the field. In fact, we're just about, Sarah is crunching our recruitment and retention numbers. We're almost done with the last final follow-up on this one. It's an opt-in, which is for weight loss treatment. So what we're trying to do in this study is we're trying to identify which components and component levels contribute most to average weight loss. This is weight loss initiation, and to the percent of people achieving at least 7% weight loss. we're looking at 5 components. One thing we're looking at, is coaching intensity. So remember, we started with we were using 8 sessions in the last study, but now we really don't know whether people need more sessions than that. So we're comparing a high and a low dose. We've learned we're not going to try to convert strangers into support buddies. Now you bring your own support buddy, and what we vary is whether we train them or not. We're varying turning on or off text messaging and progress reports, and we're varying whether we have recommendations for meal replacement. And what we do is that we're testing the main effects of these conditions. We emerge from the study with an effect size estimate for each one and a cost. And the object of our game is that we will reverse engineer the intervention that gives us the maximum amount of weight loss for $500, which is what we know insurance will pay. If you think about this in terms of those of you who are medical professionals will be familiar with the model of evidence-based medicine. This is it. What it, so I have 10 minutes left. So that, okay. So you start with, you ask your clinical question, you go to acquire the evidence, you appraise it to whether it's valid, it was a good research design, and whether it's applicable to your population, and you pull the best evidence-based practice for patients like yours. It's a reasonable place to start. It's your best one-size-fits-all practice. And this is what training in evidence-based medicine usually does. It stops here. It stops at apply. But we know that one size doesn't fit all. And we know that this treatment is going to work for some people and it's not going to work for others. If you think about what we're testing in most RCTs of treatment packages, we tested the same package for 6 months, 12 months. We did the same thing. What clinician would do that? If something is not working, you stop doing it and you do something else. This makes no sense. But this part of the evidence-based process, analyze and adjust, adapt, has had no research methodology connected to it. That's what most addresses. And the first tool to address it was SMART design, sequential multi-phase adaptive randomized interventions. Billy will talk to you more about these later in the week. This is from a SMART trial that we have in the field with Billy. And the rationale for this is really, really important. Remember, we are always doing a dance between clinical medical approaches where we have expert professionals seeing individuals and public health approaches where we're trying to treat the whole population. This goes back to the mentality of Archie Cochrane, who started the Cochrane systematic reviews, or they were named for him. The object of the game, when you're trying to optimize population health, is you know that you will never have enough resources to meet what everybody wants. Can't do that. You might have a shot at meeting what they need. So your approach needs to be to give people what they need, but not more. How do you figure out how to do that? Well, if we had achieved precision medicine, we would know this already, but we haven't. We don't know who needs what when. So we're at a stage where we have to do it pragmatically. So what we do is you start with the best evidence-based practice for one size fits all, knowing full well that it's not going to work for everybody. You figure out who it's not working for, and you try something else and systematize what you're doing. So we learn from that and other people can benefit from it. What you're doing then is rather than test a fixed treatment package like you would do in most RCTs, you're testing an algorithm. You're testing a sequence of if-then steps. Okay, so here is what this trial is doing. It is asking questions like, what's the optimal treatment sequence? Where should we start? Should we, in this case, we're asking the question of, should we start with just an app, or should we start with the app plus coaching? Then we go, if that doesn't work, how should we step up? Add another mobile health component, or intensively add a traditional component like coaching or meal replacement. Here's what the actual design looks like. So people are randomized to either the app or app plus coaching. If they're doing well, they just continue getting whatever it was they were getting. But we check them every 2 weeks. So you have 2 weeks for it not to work out, and then we'll bump you up. And what we're testing is which of these to bump up to, moderately or intensively. Notice, here's another place where your behavior change principles become really important. You've got to get people to be willing to be randomized to either of these arms, which ain't easy in US culture, because in US culture, we believe more is better. And so you have real issue with trying to make a case to people for why it might be in their best interest to be randomized to just the app alone initially, meaning that they're going to learn more from their own explorations and personalize the learning, and then you're going to be there to catch them if they need more. But these are some of the other behavioral challenges you get into when you use this method. Last thing, this is the Jedi. This is the really cutting edge one, adaptive intervention, and it's an innovation to adapt to patient states that change rapidly in real time. And there's 2 states that we're adapting to. One is changing states of vulnerability or risk, like drug use, chocolate use, overeating. And the other state is your receptivity to intervention. Both of these things are really important. And yeah, we've got some clues about what the person's state is. The study that we have in the field on this one is looking at trying to prevent smoking cessation. So what happens in smokers after they've quit is that they're at very high risk for relapse. The vast majority of them are going to relapse, and it's going to happen in the first week. And what's going to happen is that they're going to have a lot of craving, and they're going to be tempted to smoke. And once they have one puff, odds are good it's finished. That they're probably going to go back to smoking fully. So what is we ask them to call us, we give them pager numbers, we give them homework assignments to call us. They don't call us. They call us after they've relapsed, then they call us. So this is a study to try to figure out if we can get ahead of that curve using sensing of stress as a way to help them when they need help. What this Jedi, which is called Sense to Stop, is doing is it's testing a decision rule. There's 2 ways of thinking about when is the right time to intervene to keep somebody from relapsing to smoking. One is you might think, okay, stress puts them at risk of smoking, so you should intervene then rapidly. You should try to preempt the state of stress. But the other way of thinking about it is receptivity to intervention may be at its lowest then. You don't want to try to intervene with me when I'm under stress. I might scream at you. When we're stressed, our attention is limited. Our ability to learn is limited. So we really don't know which is the best time to push out this intervention. How are we doing this? This is what the system looks like. They're wearing a suite of sensors called Autosense. You'll hear about this from Santosh Kumar later in the week. It's picking up ECG and respiration. And basically, what's happening is that the data are being sent to the phone where it's crawling, the algorithm on the phone is crawling the data, and it's classifying every minute as stressed or not stressed. How does it know that? It is looking at the data that were developed in laboratory experiments where Santosh had people stick their arm in a bucket of cold water and look at what the ECG and respiration signals look like. So that's what it's telling. Is this a stress minute or is this a not stress minute? And it's also detecting whether people are smoking or not. Okay, so how do we know? So basically what's happening is that the intervention, which is that it opens a relaxation app on the phone, is happening either, it's happening either, it's being pushed out either when they're stressed or when they're not stressed. And all we're trying to figure out in this study is, does it make a difference? Is there a better time to push it out? How will we know? We will know if it's context sensitive, if it's stress sensitive. We will see that that's the only time that the intervention delays or prevents the likelihood of stress recurring or smoking recurring. We're not yet ready for a randomized control trial. When we do a randomized control trial, what we will do is to test the whole algorithm. It will be with generic treatment versus this algorithm, this tailored time-sensitive algorithm. Do we get a better result with the JEDI? Okay, so just to wrap up, so what I would suggest is that our technology-supported interventions and the reach and reduce the burden and refine the tailoring of our behavioral interventions. Even though the technology evolves pretty rapidly, a lot of these behavior change principles and mechanisms that I think are really doing the work really don't change very much. Our challenge is how do we harness them by mobile health technology. I think that although the mobile health tech can be very engaging, it's usually not the thing that in and of itself is doing the work. It's giving us new sensing channels, new delivery channels that let us change behavior better. I think these new designs that we need to do to optimize interventions are really exciting. And just to recap, the Factorial lets us design the most efficient and optimally effective interventions for the average person. The SMART lets us do stepped care decision rules for things like what should you try first, what should you do next, how long should you wait to figure out whether something is a success, wean people off of treatment, which is something we know almost nothing about and probably has something to do with why we're so bad at maintenance of most behaviors. The JEDIs help us develop tailoring rules that specify when and how to address these changing states of risk and receptivity to interventions. And my prediction, and it goes back to the observation from the text messaging, is that as we move along in this field, at the moment we're concerned about pushing out interventions. I think our equally, if not more pressing problem is going to become how to manage burden and capture moments when people are receptive to having anything else go on in their lives. So, thank you.
Great stuff.